Hi, and thanks for tuning in to Conversations with INDIAai, our leadership podcast series where we give you a glimpse into the workings of successful tech leaders, their eureka moments, their trials, their tribulations, and so much more. Today, I have with me Madhav Joshi, who's the CEO of India Health Fund, and which is essentially a fund seeded by Tata Trusts in collaboration with the Global Fund to fight infectious diseases, including TB, malaria, and more recently, COVID-19. They aggregate capital, expertise, networks to identify and nurture innovations that help bridge the gap in delivery of healthcare solutions in India. They are the only entity in the ecosystem that's accelerating innovations to tackle infectious diseases, and they work very closely with government entities as well as various tech and health tech companies to make healthcare a reality today. Madhav, thank you so much for taking the time out to do this. It's a pleasure to have you here on INDIAai.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure being here.
Absolutely. So first off, it'll be great to just give a brief overview of the real work that's happening at India Health Fund, and why are you so focused on tech-driven innovations to manage infectious diseases today?
Sure. So, India Health Fund was set up in 2017, as you mentioned, as a partnership between the Global Fund and Tata Trusts. When the Global Fund and Tata Trust came together, it was on the thesis that India and the world didn't need yet another organization that would run programs to control infectious diseases. There are plenty of them doing a very effective job. But where infectious diseases had suffered was in market failure, particularly in the availability of capital that was needed to allow prototypes of solutions which were leveraging the latest in science and technology and diagnostics to go from prototype to market readiness phase. And the market failure had a number of reasons, but the main reason was over time, communicable diseases had become diseases of the poor, primarily in developing countries funded by governments and not-for-profit. So there wasn't enough economic return for industry to invest the kind of capital that was needed to generate the returns that are required to sustain an efficient R&D engine. And that's really what has led to the significant gap in the application of science and technology for solutions in communicable diseases. And I think some of the solutions we use are a century old. TB diagnosis still primarily relies on a microscope. That's 100 years old. No other disease uses that. I mean, we've got cutting-edge solutions for everything else, which have also had, I think, significant impact on patient outcomes and lives.
Yeah.
And we've seen that in many other areas. Hasn't necessarily happened for communicable diseases. So that was the thesis on which India Health Fund was set up.
Okay.
And the organization was mandated to focus on supporting the development of solutions which could help improve outcomes in the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of communicable diseases. And the definition of solutions by the founders was deliberately kept broad.
Okay.
The solutions was product, but also financing mechanisms so that one could, I think, move away from a complete reliance on either government spending or grant spending.
Yeah.
And also in terms of delivery mechanisms, business model, and supply chain. So it was a fairly wide-ranging ambit. Now, given the scale and scope of the challenge of communicable diseases in particular, there were two ways to address the problem. One was to really bridge the gap by way of additional resources, both financial as well as manpower. But given, I think, the reality of the resource constraints, the other way to bridge that gap was to use technology as a disruptor to really provide a discontinuous solution, where technology provided capital-efficient solutions which could be implemented at scale. And that's really the reason for India Health Fund's focus on technology and diagnostics to such a large extent.
Okay, I think the decision I think has come at a very opportune time, at least in a place like India, which has just seen this burst of innovation and so much happening in terms of proliferation of technology in healthcare. So tell us a little bit more about your association with startups like, for instance, INDIAai, which is helping you in the fight against TB, and what kind of impact have you really seen to date working with them?
Sure. So our affiliation with organizations is actually pretty sector agnostic.
Okay.
So we don't have a bias towards a startup versus an established corporation versus a government or a private entity.
Okay.
Our bias is entirely towards the strength of the solution and the potential the solution has to provide a capital efficient way of bridging a solution gap that exists in a way that can be implemented at scale.
Right.
So to that extent, we're pretty agnostic in terms of whom we affiliate with, as long as they've got a strong solution, which is rooted in, I think, technology that has future potential rather than something that is at the end of its life cycle.
Yeah. Right.
So to that, I think our affiliation with INDIAai really came about at the right time. As you know, INDIAai has, I think, specialized in the application of artificial intelligence for diagnostics.
That's right.
We have a very strong focus on tuberculosis, and I think helping develop solutions which can improve the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of tuberculosis. One of the biggest challenges in tuberculosis is the long lead time from diagnosis to the initiation of treatment. And that's for a number of reasons. One is as the traditional method of diagnosis through sputum smear microscopy. And there's a long incubation period for the bacteria, which takes 6 to 8 weeks. So there is a very long lead time, which very often leads to losses of patients, deterioration. But screening is dependent on chest x-rays. And given how endemic TB is in the country, a lot of the patients with TB are in remote areas where either x-ray machines aren't widely available, or the radiologists and doctors trained to read these x-ray machines to screen and diagnose TB, which would then allow a patient to go for a sputum smear test, don't exist. So there's an even longer lag. From the x-ray to potential diagnosis to confirmatory diagnosis to the initiation of treatment. And that's where the INDIAai solution really plays a role. Because they have the ability to use a smartphone, which is now in everyone's pocket all over the country, to scan a chest x-ray, and we continue to use analog chest x-rays, to scan a chest x-ray with the app that is on the phone. And the AI algorithm linked to that can scan the x-ray and diagnose TB, put a screen for TB within 30 seconds, which is a good example of the discontinuous use of technology that we spoke about. So it overcomes the gap of the need for a trained health worker and is an extremely capital efficient way of doing it. So there's an almost immediate diagnosis, which then allows for a much faster initiation of treatment for the patient, which potentially will result in improved outcomes, because TB still kills 400,000 people a year in this country. COVID, which is on top of mind for everybody, has killed 150,000 people last year. So I think that is the scale and scope, and that's why our affiliation with INDIAai started, because of the potential for the application of their technology to a problem that IHF was trying to address using technology. And it's been, I think, a very successful affiliation since then. So as we speak, I think the INDIAai team is well on their way to not just developing, but also deploying the algorithm they have developed to demonstrate the potential of this scanning technology. And an interesting offshoot has been, I think, what I call the development of platforms. Given that TB and COVID are lung diseases and depend very much on a similar need of screening, which comes from a chest X-ray. So the Cure team were actually very adaptive, very, very efficient in terms of adapting their algorithm to adapt it to be able to screen for COVID very quickly when the pandemic started last year. And the application for COVID has been used in over 20 countries, and it's been particularly effective in hospitals for triaging when there's been large patient loads to identify patients who need early access to oxygen. So India Health Fund then collaborated with the Municipal Corporation of Mumbai and INDIAai to deploy this in Mumbai at the peak of COVID in Mumbai last year. So over 6 months, 25,000 patients were screened using the INDIAai COVID app. I think what was particularly heartening were a few things. It was possible to deploy these in peripheral areas where there weren't sufficient screening facilities.
Right.
And the deployment could be done without the need for a trained healthcare worker. So the technology really took care of the initial screening.
Right.
So a larger number of patients were screened, which obviously facilitated, I think, better control. The second thing that happened was that the app actually didn't miss a single asymptomatic patient, which was confirmed in subsequent confirmatory tests that were done as a point of comparison, which is very different from what happened with the manual screening.
Correct.
And when this was deployed at the COVID care centers that the municipal corporation was running, it allowed, I think the technology really took over patient monitoring for a number of patients, which effectively allowed the doctors and healthcare workers on duty to be able to focus on patients who really needed their attention rather than spread themselves thin.
Makes sense.
So I think those were the unexpected outcomes that we have seen. But I think it's just demonstrated again the potential that technology has in addressing real life problems in a cost-efficient way at scale, and really allowing us to optimize the use of our resources in the best possible way, with potentially better outcomes than what we have today with the conventional solutions we have.
Absolutely. I think that's such a relevant point, and something which, by and large, the medical fraternity was really able to see in its full might the past year. I think never have we felt this helpless as at a time together in humanity, where we wondered, we have the best of resources, we have the top level talent, we have the technology. How do we manage to control this virus called COVID-19? So how did India Health Fund really sort of get onto this next most obvious mission, which is to manage COVID-19? You mentioned that you worked with INDIAai in Mumbai. So how else have you really been working and rallying with other companies to make sure that this particular pandemic is under control?
So I think very early in the pandemic, we realized that what we were really doing was supporting the application of either technologies or diagnostics to develop solutions which were either designed for tuberculosis or malaria at the time.
Right.
But we also, working with our portfolio companies, realized that most of these technologies were adaptable across multiple diseases.
Sure.
That's what we set out to do. So I think a good example that we just spoken about was the INDIAai, the adaptation of the INDIAai AI algorithm from TB to COVID.
Correct.
We had also supported the development of an RT-PCR based test for tuberculosis, which was designed to be a point of care solution, battery operated point of care solution, which could be deployed anywhere in the country.
Okay.
Which gave a confirmatory test for tuberculosis within an hour and didn't need a trained healthcare worker because the unit took care of everything.
Right.
Again, as I said, the platform was very quickly adapted to develop a test for COVID, which could be run on the same platform.
Yeah.
This actually became the second Indian-made RT-PCR test to be approved by ICMR back in April last year.
Yeah.
And this was a time when RT-PCR tests were scarce, almost entirely imported, and I think a test at that time was 4,500 rupees.
That's right.
This test cost 1,350 rupees.
Okay.
So with that, we suddenly had another potential solution to help address a critical need where there was a shortage of solutions. And what India Health Fund has done is we've again collaborated with the Municipal Corporation of Bombay, who have proved to be a fantastic partner, to really help supplement their testing capacity for COVID. Because as you know, Bombay was the worst affected city in the country. Yeah. Very large number of patients continuing to contract COVID, unfortunately.
Correct. Yeah.
And while the municipal corporation had deployed just about every potential resource available, there was a gap between the rapid antigen tests that were being used and then the subsequent confirmation of patients who were asymptomatic, symptomatic patients who tested negative on these antigen tests.
Right.
As per protocol, they needed a confirmatory PCR test.
That's right.
And that's where there was a lack of capacity as well as ability to follow up with these patients. So we have collaborated with the Municipal Corporation of Bombay to supplement their testing capacity. Not just for COVID, but also for TB, because in the last year, TB notifications in Bombay have dropped significantly.
Right.
And Bombay is one of the largest urban agglomerations for TB patients in the country. Typically, there are about 5,000 patients diagnosed with TB every month. That number has dropped by half, which is obviously a big public health risk.
Yeah.
So we've collaborated with the Municipal Corporation of Bombay to strengthen TB and COVID testing capacity using these test platform that IHF has supported development of.
Okay.
This is aligned with the so-called Bi-directional testing guidelines that the Ministry of Health issued last April, which mandates that any patient being tested for COVID also be screened for TB.
Yeah.
And this has now become the first large-scale deployment of bidirectional testing anywhere in the country.
Right.
So we have deployed these test machines at public hospitals run by the municipal corporation. Any patient walking into the COVID OPD is obviously screened for COVID. That same patient is also screened for tuberculosis.
Right.
And any potential suspect, TB suspect, is then directed to the National TB Program for confirmatory testing, and if they test positive, they're put on the right treatment regime. Any patient who is screened for COVID using a rapid test, who is symptomatic but tests negative, is then directed to a confirmatory test using this platform. And again, the same patient is directed to the appropriate treatment protocols that the municipal corporation runs very effectively.
Got it.
And we also have patient follow-up agents, particularly for the patients who are diagnosed with tuberculosis, in order to continue to follow up and engage with these patients. So I think that's another example of how we are using the support we have provided to develop solutions, but also to support their deployment in a way that demonstrates impact in a public health setting, with the intention of encouraging, I think, their adoption at scale.
Right. Okay, that sounds very comprehensive as an approach. I think you're approaching more than just one pillar that needs to be addressed, and at the same time. So I think that is probably just going to be the real game changer here. So healthcare in India has always been a steep challenge. I think governments have come and gone and have tried their absolute level best to try to manage healthcare as a sector, as a need, as a public health need, essentially. So where do you think these gaps really exist, and how do you think IHF is really making a difference in this entire spectrum of things?
So I think, first of all, there's been inadequate focus on healthcare in the past. And I think if we could say any good thing that's come out of COVID has been, I think, not just awareness, but concrete action towards that. And as we've seen this year,
that's true.
Spending on healthcare has now been given not just top billing, but there's actually significant resourcing going behind supplementing healthcare.
Right.
And that will obviously go a long way towards, I think, mitigating some of the issues we have. I think the other challenge we face in the area of healthcare is, I think, what I would describe as a significant fragmentation, which is disease-focused rather than patient-focused.
Right. Right.
And there again, there is, I think, growing awareness that in order to be the most effective, the focus needs to be on early screening and diagnosis for whatever disease one is talking about.
Correct.
That has to happen at the point of care rather than a secondary or tertiary facility. I think that's where the role that IHF is playing in terms of supporting the development of platforms which can be adapted across multiple diseases. Using technology has a significant role to play, because it becomes a patient-centric approach which is disease-agnostic rather than disease-focused.
Right.
I think our biggest challenge or opportunity now is to really build collaborative action.
Mm.
Because as you yourself mentioned, it's a huge issue across the country.
Yeah.
And involves multiple players. But these multiple players haven't necessarily been coordinating action. And there is, I think, for the first time, there is awareness and intent to do that. That's the role that IHF is also trying to play, which is in addition to supporting the development of solutions, you're also building a coalition of the right players so that we can aggregate the right resources and action to not just support development but deployment at scale, so that we can collectively make sure that patient outcomes are achieved in the best possible way.
Absolutely. I think that's actually an interesting point you brought out, and I think this will be a great way to sort of conclude this discussion as well, and something which is food for thought for all our listeners as well. I think intent is in place. I think we have a lot of solid policies that are coming up or being worked on. There's a lot of good intentions right from the leadership all the way to the industry that wants to make a difference. But I think where this train sort of faces some obstacles is in terms of adoption. So where and how do you think this can change? And what are your thoughts on technologies, especially emerging ones like AI, which is being leveraged so heavily in sectors like healthcare? How can they really sort of bring about or drive more adoption in this field?
So, look, it's a great question. And I think there's increasing awareness of the role of technology, and particularly AI, where I think there's a lack of clarity across the board.
Right.
Is not just not just what solutions, but how to deploy them.
Yeah.
And to my mind, there are three ways of addressing this. One is for organizations like IHF to really demonstrate through deployment programs what these technologies can actually deliver in tangible terms. And I think the example we spoke about of using AI for COVID screening is a good one.
Yep.
The question becomes, how willing are both the public and the private sectors to really adopt these? And that's where there is an issue of regulatory approvals as well as adoption.
Yeah.
So I think that's one area that we need to address, but the opportunity exists. If a pilot scale deployment can be used to demonstrate impact, the scale up through both the public and private health systems should, I think, be much easier than it is today, provided the relevant players are willing to adopt.
Right.
And that will obviously take collaborative action, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
I think the second thing is the involvement of all stakeholders at an early stage of solution development, rather than solutions being developed by innovators as they are today. And then sort of the whole sales pitch, so to speak.
It's true.
And I think that's again where IHF is trying to, I think, break the paradigm a little bit. Where instead of supporting a good idea and then hoping it'll get pitched, we're actually trying to get the end user involved early at evaluation and design stage, so that there is a deployment pathway already available.
Correct.
And I think the third thing would be, I think, consistent action by the technology industry as a whole.
Right.
To, I think, do a lot more advocacy than is being done today.
Very true.
On the role and application of technologies, and I would actually go beyond healthcare, or go beyond AI, in healthcare, and actually I think play a more active role in that than they have been today. I think industry has certainly played a big role in evangelizing technology. It played a big role in evangelizing technology in various areas, including climate control and so on. I haven't seen the same level of activity in healthcare.
Yeah.
And until I think industry starts engaging much more effectively with the ecosystem players, this will continue to remain a challenge.
True. That's true. I think finally, I think you're right. This particular year at least has shown us that collaboration is is going to be the only thing that's going to tide us through. And healthcare is as good as a place as any to start that, really. So thank you so much for your time, Madhav. Very illuminating talking to you about the work being done in India Health Fund, and especially in the run-up to World TB Day, which is when we're going to be posting the story. I think it's very relevant that people understand how technology can play such a definitive role in beating infectious diseases like TB. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks so much for all our listeners for tuning in. And you can follow all our updates on our website, our social channels. We'll be back very soon with another exciting story. Until then, stay safe and stay connected. Thank you.